It is a foggy morning in Delhi. The morning hustle and bustle starts with people making their way to their workplaces. Some travel in their cars, and some take the good old metro. Radisson Blu Hotel holds a pristine appearance because of the hundreds of employees who work to make it look like that. They start preparing in the wee hours of the day for the arrival of the guests. Lee Iyer, an intern, arrives and starts diligently attending to the tasks allotted to her for the day. Danish, an intern in the same hotel, arrives and starts with his chores. Soon the tourists start pouring in, and it gets busy. Lee and Dan, along with many such interns, are expected to be well-rounded in every aspect of hospitality. So they are exposed to all the features and are trained on rotation. Some days they will be working in the kitchen and serving. The other days, it will be cleaning and housekeeping. They mold themselves in every role. While Lee is a diligent, meticulous worker, Dan slacks off whenever given a chance. That day Dan is again on cleaning duty. His friend jokes about him being stuck cleaning his entire training. Once done, he walks out and accidentally steps on the towels that need washing. But the second time he steps on them is intentional. Probably this is his way of taking out his frustration through actions because he doesn't talk much. All the interns have gathered as the manager addresses them. He reminds them of the bond they were made to sign before the commencement of their training. A condition in the bond said if, for some reason, the bond is broken, not only will their diploma be cancelled, but their parents will have to pay 3 lakh rupees. It has come to their notice that someone among them is stepping on the white towels with their dirty shoes. The intention of gathering everybody is to warn the one doing it. The manager reminds them there are cameras in every corridor. He then asks a question which Lee answers correctly. He takes this opportunity to berate Dan, who apparently is a senior but has to repeat his internship because of his lackadaisical attitude. Dan retorts, making a funny comment, and everyone suppresses a smile. The manager soon dismisses them. Dan's training is at the front desk for the night. A guest checks in but gets in a verbal scuffle with Dan about the kind of room he booked. He chides him and says he is a regular customer and often comes with his wife. Dan calmly reminds him that he knows he is regular because he had come with his ex-wife just last month. The wife's expressions change, and the guest warns Dan to watch out. The manager reprimands Dan on the complaint of the guest, and he is assigned the cleaning duty again, much to Dan's displeasure because he has been doing the cleaning for almost all of his training. If this was not enough, when one of the guests left their youngest kid in the hotel room, Dan went to get him and saw the kid playing with the toilet water and giving the toiletries a bath in the flush. Dan takes the kid out of the room, makes him sit on the top of the rack, and leaves him there. Later, Lee comes and finds the crying boy there. She takes the kid back to his parents. Everything was caught on the surveillance camera, and the manager is beyond furious. He makes Dan and the other trainees see the footage. Dan apologizes profoundly when the manager says he'll file an official complaint. So as a punishment, he is put on laundry duty. It is evident Dan is not interested in doing what he's doing and keeps blabbering about it until his colleague shuts him up because everybody there has had enough of Dan's constant chattering. Dan resides with his 2 best friends and fellow trainees, Manny and Isha. They plan to open a restaurant, but it is still vague, and no one knows if it will ever be executed. Lee is a quiet girl who enjoys nature. In the garden, when she picks the fallen white and vibrant orange flowers, she cannot help herself from smelling the sweet fragranced flower. After wrapping up the work, she comes back to their resting area and finds the bowl in which she collected the flowers and the flowers on the ground. Dan is sleeping on the chair nearby. She calls out to Dan and asks if he knocked off the bowl from the tabletop. Dan is irritated because of being woken up from his slumber and says he didn't do it. He taunts her, asking her to complain about it to the manager, but Lee stays quiet. She starts picking the flowers, and instead of helping her, Dan points out the flowers she has missed. Later that night, the staff is preparing for a party. There is a discrepancy between the number of champagne bottles ordered, and in the end, they are left with 3 extra. Dan takes 2 of them to the party the interns are having upstairs. The next day, the manager lines up the girls and asks them about the 2 missing bottles from the inventory. Nobody says anything, and the manager threatens them to stop saving Dan, as he knows Dan must be behind this whole ordeal. As a result, Dan is given the duty to eliminate mosquitoes with an electric racket. Dan tries to get himself out of the cleaning duty, but when his pleading doesn't seem to work, he asks for a day off on the 30th of December as it is his parents' anniversary. But his senior shot down that request too, as the hotels run at full occupancy on New Year's Eve, and they can't afford a shortage of staff. Soon it is New Year's Eve. Lee and her friends from the training are enjoying their own little party on the 3rd floor of the hotel. Dan is nowhere to be found. Lee asks where Dan is, and as she does, she sits on the edge of the terrace when her hand slips, and she rolls back and falls off the ledge. Everybody gasps as they look down at her. Soon the ambulance is called, and they immediately take her to the emergency as her breathing is very shallow. She has a deep gash on her knee, and blood oozes out from several places. Isha cries as Manny tries to console her. The manager gives Lee's information to the police. Lee has a head injury and has to be shifted to the intensive care unit. Her mother, Professor Vicky Ayer, is informed. She is confident her daughter was not intoxicated when she fell, as she doesn't drink. She tells the same to the police investigating the incident. Meanwhile, Lee is operated on to remove the blood clot from her brain. Dan finds out and meets his friends in a tea stall outside the hospital. He says they should have informed him before. Manny says he tried calling him 15 times, but he never picked up. The manager has one extra entry pass, and Isha takes it for safekeeping in case one of them plans to visit Lee. He instructs them not to talk much about the incident till the inquiry is over. Isha gives the pass to Dan and says he should visit her since he is the only one left who has yet to. She gives him the necessary details and instructions he needs to follow before meeting Lee. He goes to the hospital, but when he sees her lying with all the machines surrounding her and pipes inserted in her, he stops a few feet away from her bed. He sees her injuries and soon leaves. He cannot bring himself to see her covered in bruises and bandages. Back in his place, he tells this to his friend Manny and how scared he feels looking at her in this condition. Manny says if Dan had been there when she fell, he would have fainted for sure. They talk a little more about how the entire atmosphere of the room she was in was grave and scary. This is enough to make Dan lose his appetite, and even after much coaxing from Manny, Dan refuses to eat. Lee's condition is critical, and there are no signs of improvement. The doctors talk to Lee's family about her condition. They tell the family that Lee is neither awake nor aware. She is in a deep state of coma. Vic tries to control her tears as she hears the doctor explain her daughter's condition. Her face turns dreadful when Lee's siblings try to call out to their sister, but Lee cannot hear or perceive their voices. The reality of her situation and the uncertainty Lee's future holds scares her mother. In the coming days, Dan visits Lee many times. The doctors find the damage to Lee's brain is irreversible, but they were willing to give Lee some time to fight. Every day, Lee's family would talk to her and try not to lose hope. Lee's siblings and mother take turns staying in the hospital. Her siblings would study in the hospital and try to keep up with their studies while their mother would come home, freshen up, and then go to the Indian Institution of Technology, where she is a professor. The hospital bill is increasing day by day, and to be able to afford it, Vic has to keep up with her job as she is the sole breadwinner of the family. It has already been 2 months. Vic's brother-in-law reminds her of the growing expenses and how if Lee's dad had been alive, he would have made Lee pursue engineering and not hotel management. Dan stands there listening to their conversation. He intervenes and asks how they can talk about giving up on Lee. She is very young and has her whole life ahead. But the uncle gets irked and asks him to leave. Once Dan leaves, the uncle continues to convince Vic to make a decision soon. One day at work, Isha says she still can't believe what has happened to Lee. Usually, she stays very careful. Dan thinks Lee is very foolish, and his friends have overrated her. Isha points out how everybody was enjoying themselves, and nobody paid much attention to how it happened. She starts recalling that night's events, and Dan comes to know that just before slipping from the ledge, Lee had asked where he was. Dan is deeply affected by this information. He goes to the 3rd floor, which is now barricaded to avoid any more accidents. He looks over the ledge from where Lee had slipped. He reaches back home and gets angry at Manny for not telling him that Lee's last words before falling were, "Where is Dan?" Manny and one other friend say she was generally asking, and it is not a big deal. But for Dan, it is a big deal, and he feels agitated thinking about it. He feels he owes her an answer but doesn't know how he'd make it reach her. Unable to take it anymore, he decides to visit Lee in the hospital. But he is denied entry as he doesn't have a night visiting pass. He tries his best to convince the guard, saying he just wants to say a thing to a patient, and he would be back in a jiffy. But the guard doesn't budge. Feeling dejected, he sits on a bench nearby. Another man is already sitting there, and he tells Dan the security guard is very strict and wouldn't allow access. Determined, he tries one more time and manages to enter the building. He requests the other security guard at the shoe counter to allow him in for not more than 2 minutes. After a little convincing, he is granted access, and Dan goes to meet Lee. He tells her on New Year's Eve he wasn't around. He couldn't say much after that and left. But he didn't want to leave her just yet, so he sleeps on a stretcher outside the hospital until the guard comes and asks him to leave, as they don't allow anybody to sleep there. He wakes up and goes to sleep on the bench at the tea stall. Dan is baffled at the prospect of Lee's last words being about him. He wants to know why she was asking about him or if she was interested in him because he feels a person's last words are meant to be special. To clear his doubts, he asks Isha to meet him, leaving her vexed when she finds out the reason why he called her. Isha goes back as her shift isn't over yet. Dan spots Lee's car, still parked in the parking lot, and decides to take it back to Lee's house. Isha helps him navigate through the gate at the Ayers residence. Vic thanked Dan and Isha for bringing the car back as she got so tangled between the hospital and college. Dan tries to console Vic in his own innocent way by telling her how he fractured his bone once, and it didn't heal in the anticipated period and took longer than that, just as Lee is taking. But he is sure she will be fine eventually. Hearing this brings a smile to Vic's face. Dan now lingers at the hospital, not willing to go back. Every time he comes to visit Lee, he checks her urine bag. The nurse recognizes him but fails to understand why he stays there when he doesn't have a connection or relation with the patient. Today the urine bag seems fuller than usual, so he asks the nurse if they increased the fluids. When she denies it, he concludes that the brain is functioning normally and hasn't affected the functioning of her kidneys, which is a good thing. Dan has made the hospital his home. He sleeps there, freshens up there, stays there for most of the day, and even interacts with the other attendants to pass his time. He even gets possessive when one of the cleaning workers takes too long to clean Lee's bed and space. Later, Dan warns the worker not to stare at Lee. Dan juggles between his training and the hospital. He leaves at every chance he gets, but one day gets caught up because of full occupancy at the hotel. He is back in the hospital and gets coffee for Lee's family. Her uncle starts complaining about the rising expenses again. He contends if Lee is never going to recognize them, then what is the point? Dan intervenes as usual and says at least they can recognize Lee, and that should be enough. Vic agrees with Dan and says her daughter deserves a chance to fight. That night when Dan comes back, he finds Isha and Manny are secretly dating. They come clean, and Dan is happy for them. Isha reminds Dan that they have been covering his shifts. They suggest he needs to focus on his work or he'll lose his job. He says he didn't ask them to do it for him. They are trying to help and even cover for him financially, but this has started to negatively impact not just his work but his relationship with his friends too. Lee suffers a seizure and a stroke. She is paralyzed, and the doctors say she is unlikely to recover from the paralysis her entire life. Lee's uncle makes Vic feel guilty for keeping Lee alive even if it is the machines performing most of the bodily functions for her. But Dan thinks Lee would have wanted to stay alive. Later he meets Lee and points out that her uncle should be sent to the jungle as he has the patience of a monkey. Dan believes there is no harm if the machines are keeping Lee alive. One night Dan cannot sleep in his home. He wakes up late at night and walks out on the terrace. He sees the parked cars downstairs, which have the same flowers Lee once collected fallen on them. He collects some and smells the sweet fragrance of those flowers. He collects some and takes them to the hospital for Lee and places it on the bedside table. Dan is exhausted between his work and the hospital and sleeps anywhere and anytime he gets a chance. The next morning when the nurse comes to check her vitals, she notices Lee flaring her one nostril. It is a movement she has made on her own after a long time. Immediately the doctors are informed. The doctors tell her family that sometimes the coma patients react to a strong smell, like in this case, night jasmine flowers. It is a positive sign that she is conscious, and they should continue the treatment. One day the manager visits the laundry room to give them his blazer for washing when he sees Dan sleeping during his shift. The manager knows how Dan has been going to the hospital and staying there all night. This time he lets Dan off the hook. Dan befriends the nurse who usually attends Lee. He keeps bringing the flowers in anticipation of seeing her twitch her nose again. The nurse informs him that Lee's uncle will be on duty today as her mother is unwell. Dan requests the nurse to make Lee's uncle sit away from the ventilator plug, making the nurse chuckle. He goes out to buy Lee's medicines, and they are very expensive. So he has to take a trip to the ATM to get money for the medicines, but he isn't left with much money. So he asks his friends, and Manny gives him 20,000 rupees. One morning Lee opens her eyes, and the doctor performs an eye movement exercise which she successfully performs. She does it again when her family comes, and Dan arrives there on time to see the significant development Lee has made. Vic has tears in her eyes as she is hopeful again for her daughter. She wishes her daughter to be healthy again so she can go home with them. Vic can only manage to say that much before breaking down, all while she was keeping a strong front. When finally all her prayers were answered, she let her emotions take over this once. Dan tries the same exercise on Lee once everyone is gone. Lee responds well and moves her iris. Dan is overwhelmed with emotions as he stands near the window. His tears told us how happy he was, and as it rained, nature cried with him, happy tears. Dan had developed an unspoken connection with Lee all those times he missed his work just to be with her and care for her. He felt he should be there with her because she was thinking of him just before falling, for reasons unknown to him. After his shift is over, Dan is leaving for the hospital when Isha stops him to talk to him. She is concerned that Dan is too consumed with Lee, to the extent he has been neglecting his own family and work. But Dan is unhappy with his friends and how unaffected they are by this whole ordeal. Isha says they are worried for Lee, but that doesn't mean they'll neglect work and other responsibilities. Not in the mood to argue, Dan leaves without saying anything. At the hospital, doctors are checking her responses, and she is able to identify her siblings Kunal and Carrie, but when Dan asks the doctor to include his name, Lee doesn't recognize Dan. Dan feels a bit discouraged, considering they've worked together, and Kunal doesn't help because he reminds Dan that Lee didn't even recognize him. That evening when he is alone with Lee, he asks if she recognizes him, and Lee answers yes by moving her eyes. He gets why she refused to recognize him in front of everybody and smiles shyly. He asks her to keep them a secret and keep pretending not to recognize him when asked. Dan is living off his friend's money now. In the cafeteria, while having lunch, Manny tells Dan that he paid his rent this month too. Dan apologizes as his stipend is not much these days because he has been missing out on work a lot, and whatever he gets, he's spending it on Lee. He says they should talk about this back home and not in the cafeteria. Manny lets him know that their other friend Addie is shifting with them because he cannot afford the rent alone. Dan doesn't say anything and leaves. Lee starts to get better with constant care from her family and Dan. She is soon shifted to a private room, which Carrie and Kunal decorate with their pictures. Dan brings his picture and sticks it at the foot of the bed so that Lee can constantly see it. He sleeps on the sofa in the room since he doesn't have a home now. One day Dan is called into the office by the administration for an explanation. He has attended to his duties for only 55 days in the span of 7 months. The manager tries to placate the general manager, but the complaints about Dan's temperamental issues doesn't help his case. He is reprimanded and given a last warning before action is taken if he keeps up this kind of attitude towards his profession. The manager accompanies him outside, and he makes him understand that it is just a matter of 2 months. If he can manage that, he'll get his diploma and will be free from the responsibilities. Dan agrees and thanks his manager for vouching for him. Dan is on serving duty at the cafeteria. One of his colleagues reminds him rather rudely that he isn't wearing his gloves. Dan tries to ignore him and continues serving, but the man initiates a verbal fight. Dan loses his cool and smacks away that man's plate before the two get into a scuffle. The other people intervene to stop them. Manny drags Dan away. Everybody looks at Dan in disbelief. Dan comes back to the tea stall and is surprised to see his mother waiting for him there. She has come to meet him after his institution sent her a letter, informing her that her son Dan is rusticated from the institution. And, as per the bond, they will have to pay 3 lakh rupees. He has wasted not only his parents' money but 3 years of his life. Dan says he'll figure it out, but a mom knows better. She is worried for her son and asks him what has happened to him. He has made the hospital his home. He has dark circles because of lack of sleep. She just wants to know what is going on. She asks Dan if the girl admitted is his girlfriend. Dan doesn't say anything but takes her to meet Lee. Lee is sleeping when Dan's mom comes to meet her. Vic tells her how Dan has been like a pillar to her, especially at times when she feels she can't do it anymore. But Dan's mom is not pleased with the situation as she thinks Dan should have become her pillar, but he doesn't have time for his own parents. But before they can talk more, Dan comes to inform Vic they need some files but are unable to locate it, and Vic leaves the room for a few minutes. Dan's mom is left alone with Lee. She looks at the girl who has been in bed for almost a year and for whom Dan sacrificed everything. She realizes Dan has made his decision. When Vic comes back, she finds Dan's mom gone. Vic discerns Dan's mom is not happy, so that night, when Dan comes, Vic asks him to leave. He has a job, a life, and his parents' expectations to fulfill. She says she'll manage from now on, and with that, she sends him away. Dan soon leaves for Kalu to work at a cafe called La Raisa. He is welcomed by the new manager. He takes out his recommendation letter, but his previous manager has spoken very highly of him, because of which the recommendation letter is not required. Dan joins as a manager in the cafe and is introduced to his team. He works diligently, but in his spare time, he can only think about Lee. It is Christmas. Dan calls Vic to check on Lee. Vic says they have been under stress for a couple of days, as Lee had stopped responding for some days initially, and then she had a seizure in her sleep. She had to be taken back to the ICU. Doctors say it is common, but if it happens repeatedly, then it can lead to severe cardiac problems. She has some movements in her control, but when the physiotherapist wanted Lee to do an exercise, Lee became violent and started to scratch herself. Her hands had to be tied up. Last night also, she was restless. She had to be sedated. Vic says it is a part of their life now and asks Dan to focus on his job. But Dan couldn't stay away after knowing Lee's condition. He is back in the hospital with all his luggage. Vic smiles as she sees him sitting in the waiting area. She can't help but feel relieved as Dan has been a constant support. That day the physiotherapist tries to make Lee exercise, but Lee just flings her mitten-covered hands and doesn't want to comply. Dan asks the doctor if he can take Lee out for some time. He takes her by the window and apologizes for leaving her abruptly. He promises he won't leave her now. Lee has tears flowing down her cheek as she is glad Dan is back. That night Dan stares at her sleepily and asks her to sleep. In the time spent together, Dan has fallen deeply in love with Lee, and this hasn't gone unnoticed by Lee. She could see him making efforts, caring for her, and contributing to improving her. She, too, has developed a bond with him. And when he left, she realized how much she missed him and couldn't be alive without him, which led to the deterioration of her health. But now he's back, and she is much better now. Manny meets Dan to give him his bike keys. He is upset with Dan because Dan is meeting him 2 days after his arrival. Lee's health improves greatly as now she mumbles words. Dan is helping in building a ramp for Lee on her front porch. She is being discharged from the hospital. Lee is happy to be back home. She looks at her violin and the paintings and pictures on the wall. She is back after a year. Dan has left everything and is only focused on taking care of Lee. He occasionally takes her to the park. On one such stroll, he asks her why she had asked about him just before falling off the terrace. She tries telling him by saying his name. She manages to say it twice. Dan takes her back and tucks her into the bed. He and Vic discuss how it is very cold that day and Vic advises him to leave soon as it is going to be foggy. Dan bids Lee bye and says he'll see her tomorrow. As he leaves, Lee looks at him, wondering if Dan did all the things for her just because she asked about him before falling. The next morning Dan sees Lee outside his room in a wheelchair. He soon wakes up and realizes it was a dream. His phone is vibrating. He checks his phone, and he has 3 missed calls from Lee's home. Dan reaches Lee's home and finds many people gathered. Kunal sits on the doorstep and cries while Vic is inconsolable. Dan goes into Lee's room and sits there appalled. Carrie tells him that the previous night Lee had a seizure, and her lungs collapsed, and in half an hour, she was gone. Dan is heartbroken, and he sits there crying. Even as he goes to collect Lee's death certificate, He can't stop his tears. Later, Dan sits with Vic and her children. Vic remembers Dan had once asked her why she named her Lee. She tells him that Lee was fond of night jasmine flowers, which are also called Lee. Lee would wait for October every year because these flowers bloom in October. All night long, these flowers would fall, and she would collect them on a sheet with her grandfather. These flowers have a short life. They bloom at night, and by dawn, they fall off. To this, Dan sorrowfully remarks how Lee, too, was short-lived, just like her namesake. Several months have passed. Dan was rehired by the hotel, Radisson Blu, where he completed his diploma in the next 6 months, and thereafter got hired as sous chef. He gets a call from Vic after a long time and immediately goes to visit them. Dan says he's abiding by what Vic had told him to focus on his work. Vic shares she sometimes feels like talking about her daughter, but she doesn't have anybody to talk to. She doesn't want to upset others. She tells him they are moving back to her hometown. She doesn't want to leave the Lee plant there. Dan promises to take it with him. After Vic and her family have moved, Dan takes the plant with him to take care of it as he did for Lee. He showers it with the unconditional love that he now carries in his heart for her, even though she's gone forever.